Okay, so today we're going to dive into this pretty devastating situation.
Yeah.
A huge earthquake just hit Myanmar,
That's it.
7.7 magnitude.
Yeah.
And we're talking, over 3,300 people dead, thousands injured.
Right.
And the thing is, beyond just the immediate horror of this natural disaster,
Yeah.
there's this growing controversy bubbling up about how the U.S. is responding or not responding to this crisis.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me how quickly the conversation has pivoted
Right.
to like what is America's role in this,
Right.
in global aid
Yeah.
when a disaster like this happens.
Exactly. And a lot of critics are pointing to, they're pointing fingers at the fact that USER was kind of taken apart
Yeah.
under the previous administration.
Right.
And they're saying that because of that, the U.S. just doesn't have the ability to respond quickly and effectively
Yeah.
to these kinds of situations.
The infrastructure's not there.
The infrastructure's not there. And they're talking about a lack of crucial, resources
Yeah.
that are needed in those first, 24, 48 hours.
Right.
Like search and rescue teams with sniffer dogs, that kind of thing. And just so everyone remembers USAID, that's the U.S. Agency for International Development.
Yeah.
And that was, kind of like that was the main government body that handled, this kind of disaster relief effort.
Exactly. And so, if that's been weakened,
Right.
in the name of, efficiency or whatever,
Right.
we have to then ask, what happens
Yeah.
when something like this happens?
Exactly. What are the real world consequences?
Yeah.
Now, Secretary of State Marco Rubio,
Right.
he's offering a very different perspective.
Yeah.
And he's basically saying, look, the U.S. isn't, the world police.
Right. Not the government of the world.
We're not the government of the world. Right. And he's also asking, why aren't other countries like China or India, why aren't they picking up more of the tab for these kinds of disasters?
That's a huge point, right? Like,
Yeah.
it really gets to the heart of this debate about, how much responsibility do individual nations have in a globalized world where something happens in, Southeast Asia, but it impacts everyone.
Exactly. And this idea of burden sharing that Rubio's talking about.
Right.
I mean, that speaks to a really significant shift.
It does.
In how, global politics are working.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, you have all these former aid officials who are pushing back and saying, no.
Right.
USAI used to be so good at this.
Yeah.
We had the capacity for rapid response. And they're worried that the U.S. is basically, intentionally made itself weaker.
Crippled themselves.
When it comes to humanitarian crises.
Right.
And all of this is happening while you have people, survivors in Myanmar, literally digging through the rubble.
Desperate.
Just desperate, right? And then you have all these NGOs who are on the ground.
Yeah.
They're saying that the U.S. is abandoning its, longstanding humanitarian role.
That it used to be known for.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it really forces us to ask, is this a fundamental change in American foreign policy?
Is this the new normal?
Is this the new normal? Right.
Where America's first.
Right.
And, only looking out for America and these, humanitarian impulses are kind of secondary.
Exactly. Or is it more like what Rubio's saying?
Right.
Which is that, look, the world's changed.
Yeah.
And we need to adapt.
Responsibilities have to be shared more broadly.
Responsibilities have to be shared.
Yeah.
So to kind of recap, right?
Yeah.
We have people saying, look, this is a massive human tragedy.
Right.
Weakening USI has made it worse.
Made the U.S. response worse. Yeah.
The U.S. response worse. And then on the other side, you have people saying, look,
yeah,
America first.
America first.
Other countries need to step up.
Pick up the slack financially.
Right. And this brings us to a really important question.
Yeah.
Thinking about what's happening in Myanmar right now.
Right.
And how these different viewpoints are clashing.
Yeah.
What could this mean for how the world responds to disasters in the future?
Yeah. What are the long-term consequences of all of this?
Yeah. And how will America's changing role, be perceived in these kinds of situations?
In times of crisis.
Exactly.
Going forward.
Yeah.
Lots to think about.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
For this deep dive into this really complex situation.
Really important.
Really important.